Thank you very much. I'm somebody who likes to walk when he does a lecture. So if you don't see my face, you can see the image. The subtitle of my lecture is also Inversion and Subtraction. And this is, it's a little bit light, but this is the most close building to Luxembourg that we are on the moment are starting to construct. It's in Strasbourg. It's at the bridge between Strasbourg and Kehl, where the tram goes across the Rhine Canal. And this is a tower of 60 meters high, built in brick, probably as a symbol between Germany and France on the Nile, on the Rhine. And you can see that it has steps, and these steps, they create a tower that becomes thinner to the top and creates different angles and a certain sculptural effect. It's a residential tower. Within the plinth, it has even double height maisonettes, and in the top, it has again double height maisonettes as a kind of penthouse. And this volume is the result not of an architect getting a site and then he designs a building, but the building is the result of an urban envelope, which is 65 meters high and fills the whole site. From this envelope, pieces of volume have been cut off down in order to arrive at a reduced volume that fits as an urban sculpture in space. And this is very important for our attitude. And this is a little bit referring to the title, Inversion and Subtraction. We rather try, when we have a site, to fill it as much as possible with as much volume as you can, and then take down volume in order to see what is left afterwards. So before I start, I would like to make some advertisement of 3 books we just released. The first book is called The Noise Landscape, and it's about the noise contours around airports in Europe and the urbanization that is related to the position of an airport, the city, and its noise contours that prohibit the extension of the city. In this book, we look at the noise contour from the inverted side. So we look at the noise contour as a positive instrument in order to keep space empty to prevent the city from expanding too much. And this is a kind of instrument of design that we deploy when we are advising cities and airports on how to deal with their airport area. The second book is called Urban Loopholes. This is a very interesting book. It's a book about the French concession in Shanghai, which is a beautiful brick European neighborhood in Shanghai. And actually, for me, it's the only neighborhood in the whole of Asia where I would like to live, if I had to live in Asia. And in this neighborhood, there's a kind of parallel development. First of the emergence of creative industries, small-scale entrepreneurship, and on the other hand, the emerging consciousness about heritage in the city of Shanghai. And these two have been worked together in order to create very interesting urban transformation principles. And the third book is called State Beyond the State, and it's about the special economic zone as a case study, Shenzhen, how a country deploys a special economic zone with specific rules to boost its economy, and at the same time investigate what are the spatial effects in terms of urbanization that such a special economic zone has as a result. This is the New York zoning law, and you saw this tower in Strasbourg just a minute ago. You can see on this drawing that we did not invent anything new. Instead, we did something very old. This is a drawing by Hugh Ferris, an architect and illustrator from the 1900s, 1920s, taking a New York block and making a diagram of the New York zoning law. You were allowed to build something like 25 meters high, solid, and then you had to cut out volume and setback in order to let daylight into the streets, and 30% of the block's surface was allowed to grow into the sky. And architects used this diagram in order to model different kinds of buildings within this envelope. So this is the principle that we often deploy. For instance, in this neighborhood in Rotterdam, the Wijnhaven, which led us to be appointed as the people who are defining the high-rise strategy of the city of Rotterdam, in which we developed a kind of dynamic version of this New York zoning law, allowing as much built volume as possible, as long as buildings do not hinder each other. And the principle that it works like is that every owner in this area who has a building can extrude his plot with a tower as long as he leaves the plinth intact. He needs to create a 20-meter high urban block with courtyard, and on top of that he's allowed to create a tower. The tower needs to be, can be as high as he wants, and he can also be put anywhere he wants, as long as he doesn't hinder other people in terms of daylight access, sun, shading, and view lines towards the river. And this is not visible. This is an example of one of these towers. These towers are all between 75 and 125 meters. They never are bigger in width than about 20 to 30 meters. We did not tell the architects and the developers to do that. It happens automatically, because the rules that we made, they say if you make a fat lower tower, you will have a lot of apartments that are oriented towards the north. You don't have a good view, so you will not do that. If you make a very high tower, you have so many staircases and pipes and elevators that there's not enough surface for the dwellings anymore. So there's a kind of optimum which is ranging between around 75 and 120 meters, which most people will do, and they will build that on top of this plinth. So the result is this different development of towers in the inner city of Rotterdam, and it works very well. And you can see it is a kind of reverse thinking. You do not think like an old-fashioned urbanist or architect, oh, what can this neighborhood have? We shouldn't go too high. It's destroying the scape of the city. No, you say, let's just see what happens if we make it very high and very full, and then we just cut out what we think should be cut out. And effectively, the urban contextuality of these designs is actually much stronger in very many cases than when you do it in the traditional way. An example is the railway station area of Zurich, which we also do the master plan of. It's a very compact, very beautiful city. It's one of the most beautiful cities in Europe. I'm sorry, the projector is not completely perfect. But this is the master plan. Here you see the railway station and the railways. Here you see the surrounding neighborhoods. This master plan almost does nothing. What does it do? It creates a diagonal connection between two important points, the station square and one of the busiest shopping streets. And then it continues all the existing streets from the neighborhoods. The resulting squares or blocks, if you like, are being defined as blocks that have a certain height. And on top of the height, also a certain high-rise development is possible. Here you see this neighborhood under construction. It's quite far already, and it works in the same way. Here you see it from the top. This is the railway station. This is the diagonal boulevard that connects this busy street here with the railway station square. And you see here the different streets being continued. That results in these blocks. These blocks have, when they are big enough, they have courtyards. When they are smaller, they have atria or something like that. And then they are allowed to, on top of their podium, have towers. And so you get a kind of play of lower parts and higher parts. This is the way we designed it. Again, we filled the whole area completely with volume. And then we cut out the streets, the squares, and the public spaces. Then we cut out the inclined planes that provide the shade for daylight access. And then we had some other lines that we used to reduce the volume in order to create a certain silhouette working and certain landmark working in the area. And the result is this. We made a special model which is made out of wire, as you can see. And within this wire, developers and architects are relatively free to develop their buildings. And as long as I do that, there is a compatibility between the buildings for the development. And here you see the buildings under construction. This is, for instance, a quite nice example by the architects Caruso St. John. You see here this podium level, and it has two housing towers on top of it. This part is offices, and this part is gastronomy. And we have a facade on the side of the existing neighborhoods, which are rather mixed use, a little bit creative, student, artist neighborhoods. So the shops and the cafes here, they are smaller and they have a lower rent than the real estate on the other side, which is bigger and more representative and pays a little bit for the services that can be housed into this building. Here you see this main boulevard under construction. The houses on this side, on the railway side, are not yet ready, but here you see an impression. This middle building is by Wiel Arets Architects, and you see also that here it has two towers on top of a podium. What is interesting is that when this got built, we already discussed with the city and the railway company to create a very mixed use area. So you have cinemas, you have a hotel, you have an old age home, you have gastronomy and shops, you have offices, you have a pedagogical academy. So it's really quite a dense mixed-use area, and there were a lot of offices also. I think 35% or 40% offices, who were, when the project was almost rented out, the last 3 to 4 buildings were rented by Google in order to establish their European headquarters. So like what happens now in Silicon Valley, which is that these firms are moving out, at least with their representative office, back into San Francisco, occupying old factories or trying to sit in the neighborhood of the connectivity points in the old city. Google has now tries out here an ideology or a kind of policy to rent buildings that are by different architects, that are not necessarily related to each other, that are having a relationship of foot distance and nothing else, in order to create movement of their employees through the streets, in order to create coffee shops where the people can sit and have a dedicated activity, because they have the idea that creativity happens in these places. And so there is a kind of cloud emerging, which also consists of enterprises that are not Google, but that are maybe delivering something to Google, or are settling there because they are related in terms of other activities. And this kind of clustering today is called an urban ecosystem, or a programmatic ecosystem. And these are becoming quite important part of planning larger urban districts nowadays. It's quite exciting. And of course, here it works very well because we are at the railway station and we have Google, so it's all very luxury. But the trick is, of course, also to do that in more problematic areas. So here you see the originally meant to be Le Corbusier-Platz, but as the government of Zurich is red-green, and Le Corbusier was an anti-Semitic guy, his name will not be on this square. This is another subtractive project. This is also a new project that we just won. You will say, when you look at this, that this is, looks more like a 1970s Hermann Hertzberger building. If you tell me that, then I'm very proud, because he was one of my teachers. And he was, of course, famous for his structuralist attitude, in which he created rather labyrinths in which people more or less lose their way and are having an open system of encounter within a larger complex. This building is on the place of a whole neighborhood in Seoul, in Korea, which tries to create an alternative to the big Samsung boxes that are happening all over the place here. How we do that, we were confronted with the situation which you see here in the middle, which still has a lot of alleys and walkways that are from the original hutong-like typology. Hutongs are houses that are patio houses with an internal courtyard, closed walls to the outside, and then very narrow alleys that form the access. And this neighborhood is this has almost all been destroyed except in the basement area. And what you see here is just very shitty architecture from the post-war period, consisting of corrugated metal and concrete and so on. It's owned in the meantime by a few owners, 60 owners. There are about 180 buildings. And what we try to do is to recreate a kind of grain of scale that we then extrude into the height until the maximum height of the building envelope. So what normally happens is, if you have a neighborhood like this, then the bulldozers and caterpillars are coming. And then in the end, you will have this kind of what they call Samsung boxes in Seoul, being built with glass facades. And what we try to do is to recreate this kind of parcellation in the roofscape of the buildings. So, sorry. Here you see the roofscape of the complex. The complex has this has taken over these pathways that are still there, and has turned the intermediate levels into buildings. These buildings, they are terraced because the height limitations are very running from very high to very low, because there's a big monument here in the south, which is the tomb of the kings of Korea. So the building has to be very low here and is very high there, and therefore we have turned the plots, the original plots of the building, as an interpretation into roof terraces that step down from the top to the bottom. So therefore it looks very much like a Hermann Hertzberger building. And it has actually two public levels, three public levels, the ground, the in-between, and the top. You see one of the intermediate spaces, the intermediate level, and here you see the top, which is partly covered also with greenery. I'm afraid that this is not my slide, but this is a bit the projector. I cannot explain you this now, because you can see it. But what we have done is we have discovered that if you walk, this is very interesting about Seoul. Seoul is a very old city, and everything which is underground, so as soon as you start digging, you find medieval stone structures, houses, all kinds of equipment from those times and so on. And they have simply covered the whole stuff and put these skyscrapers and other big concrete and corrugated houses on top of that in the post-war period. And so what we do is we more or less lift the building up in many places and dig out the basements in order to lay these old structures free and create a kind of ground floor scape that more or less is a landscape of archaeology next to the gastronomy shops, workshops, and so on that are in the ground floor. So that's what happens on this level. And yeah, again, I'm sorry that I can't explain it in this slide. Here you see the roof scape of the building. And in the end, you see here this park where the tombs of the kings are. You see that it is really like a rock. It kind of goes up to the back where it is highest, and then it goes down here to this square in the front. So it's a question of subtraction of a large cube, if you like, cut out the streets, cut out public spaces, then use the parcellation of the original plots to step down by means of roof terraces, and in the end you get a volume that is both labyrinthic and architecturally excited, and is really an alternative to the buildings that the big companies in Seoul are building everywhere, all over the place, because Korea is also a country in which very large corporations, politics are interwoven, and therefore the cities are also the result of let's say, bonds between politics and capital, and that is not always very good for urban design and urban development. This is a page from this book, The Noise Landscape. This is the page which starts the talk about Amsterdam. And here you see the city of Amsterdam. And you see here the noise contour of the runways, around the runways of the airport. You see the beach park, etc. The city of Haarlem, city of Leiden, Hoofddorp, Aalsmeer. And our thesis is that these noise contours have a productive effect on urbanization, because if the airport would not have been in that place, probably Amsterdam and Haarlem would have been growing together with Leiden. So you would have an enormous city, which has not happened. And our thesis is that this is the result of the fact that the airport leaves a certain empty spot in the development, and therefore can also be considered as a positive effect. This positive effect can be turned into a landscape park where the contours of the city are very strongly defined. Because you cannot build houses within the noise contour. You can build as many houses as possible directly outside this noise contour. So what actually happens is that this contour is ever more consolidating, and it almost becomes a kind of central park if you like, within the development of the city center. So that's a policy that we proposed to the province, to the cities of Amsterdam, Haarlem, Hoofddorp, and Zaanstad. And they are now looking into this, whether they are going into a new project, which is quite a challenge, in which together they will commission us to make a master plan for a landscape park that at the same time is an airport with its noise. This is already consciously started. So this is, for instance, the park Buitenschot in Schiphol Airport. It's a park designed by Dirk Simons, landscape architects, and it is consisting of stripes that are designed in such a way it's a relief consisting of dikes that it disperses the noise, and at the same time it has become one of the most popular parks in the surroundings of the city of Hoofddorp. So let's say the contour of this noise landscape, if you like, is already in the process now of consciously being developed by different parties. Another thing about the airport edge is that it's a very strange edge, because inside the airport boundaries, everything is a hyper order. Every square centimeter is organized. And directly outside the contour, because of the vague condition of allowance of building permits and so on, the land is traditionally cheap, and therefore all kinds of strange activities like pirate parking or pony farms or car demolishing companies are settling directly around this perimeter. This is a big chance, because it also means that it is quite easy to acquire this land and to turn it into a qualitative edge of the city. And one of the recent projects we did, I was for 5 years, from 2005 to 2010, I was responsible for the urban design and architecture of Schiphol Airport. Is the golf course that is more or less an extension of the airport landscape on the one hand, the Amsterdam forest on the other hand, which is a kind of wedge of green that goes very deep into the city. And this golf course is, let's say, an intermediate usage in between. Airports are exploiting increasingly golf courses all over the world. First of all, sport fields like football fields or potato fields or golf courses settled near airports because the land was cheap and you could have a lot of land because it was not usable for something else. Since 10-15 years, people discovered that if you go to the golf course, clubhouse, you will meet a director of a cargo institution, you will meet a director of the airport authorities, you will meet a pilot, you will meet a farmer, you will meet the owner of one of the greenhouses in which the palm trees for Dubai are being grown. In other words, one has discovered that golf courses are places of business for innovative aviation-related activities. And this results in airports setting up golf courses on purpose, deliberately. It's a policy now. So this is the most important golf course in South Korea, directly adjacent to Incheon Airport and exploited by the airport. The golf course of Schiphol Airport is exploited by Schiphol Airport. Singapore has it, many airports have it. It is a very strange example of a kind of transforming functionality that happens on the edge of such a condition. Now, how do we deal with that when we do a real complicated urban design? This is the city center of Montpellier. This is the Mediterranean. Here's the lagoon. Here you have the beach villages. La Grande Motte is here. Somebody of you maybe has a flat here. And this is the airport, which is a very interesting airport because the relationship between airports, railways, and budget airlines leads to very interesting situations. So I discovered by flying here, because I can fly here with EasyJet from Basel when I have to go there, that this is a hub for Algerian and Moroccan workers that live in Düsseldorf or in Luxembourg or in Eindhoven or in Utrecht. They fly to Montpellier for 25 euros, then they switch to Agadir Airlines, and then they fly for 25 euros to Agadir. And so it has become a business as a kind of mini hub for budget airlines of Maghreb people between Northern and Middle Europe and the Maghreb. But that to the side. This contour here is a beautiful piece of landscape which is between the sea and the airport and the city, and has been defined as the position of the new TGV station for Montpellier. So if you look what happens there, this is going to happen there. It's already happening there. Like we do in Switzerland, in Germany and in Holland, where we say, okay, if we have a ECA connection, a high-speed railway, we would like to have the high-speed railway main station kept in the city center because it activates the city center, it creates less mobility, and it saves, let's say, our inner cities. In France, the city has nothing to say about the railway and the position of the station. And the SNCF in Paris, they decide we're going to make this trace here. We just kind of pull a line that goes from Nîmes to Barcelona as fast as possible. And we create a railway station here. In addition, the Autoroute Sud de France, they decide, okay, we are going to do a bypass motorway here. But they do not talk to the railway. They say this existing motorway, we make a kind of boulevard périphérique for the agglomeration of Montpellier. So this is a situation. Then you have the airport with its noise that is applicable to this landscape. So this situation is then the base for a tender. So then they ask for urban designers according to the European bid regulations to apply as an urban designer. So we did that and we got the job. So it's a very typical task because today these kind of large-scale urban design commissions are not so much super jobs where you can make a fantastic utopia, but these sites, in these sites, your work is to repair all the wrong decisions that have been made to create the point of departure of this project. So you are a kind of doctor that heals a kind of sick patient in a way. So this line is now being dug there, and it's my fault. I designed this line eventually, but there's a good thing about it. This line is not the high-speed railway line, and it's not the motorway that is somewhere here. No, it is the high-speed railway line and the motorway put cold against each other. It took us, you see it running from here to there, it took us about 8 months talking with all the politicians and the representatives of the companies. We ended after 8 months at the table of the Minister of Traffic in Paris, and he himself had to decide, okay, you are going to lay these two lines next to each other. these people have so much, are so unexperienced in coordination that a couple of months later, the people from the Autoroute de France suddenly saw an electric transformator house of the railway in the middle of their motorway, and vice versa. So we had also an enormous task to mediate between the motorway people on the one hand and the railway people on the other hand, to get them coordinate their work and do not make double installations. You know, you have, for instance, you have water retention basins. They wanted to build double water retention basins, one for the motorway, one for the railway. It's just nonsense. It's an enormous amount of work, but we managed to do that. Here we dug in the whole bundle so that there's no sound. The only sound is from the runway. Here we made a bridge system, and here in this middle part we created building blocks that protect against the emissions and the noise by having basements of parking, etc., and double facades to the outside. And by means of laying these two bundles together, we could make a big square on top of it, because you can bridge it in one go, and then you still have sufficient area left on the north and the south side to make something decent out of it. And you can cross this square and make a railway square out of it, with a tram line going from the airport across it to the city center. There's also, like in Zurich, we project here Polytechnical School Cluster, so that it is activated by certain critical mass of public functions. And you can clearly see this is the retention basin of one of the rivers that are there, and this is another one. And these rivers are very, they look very innocent, but they are very dangerous. They look like they are always dry, and then suddenly after a thunderstorm they have 1 meter of water across the whole width of this zone. So what we actually did was also, we inverted the task. We didn't say we are going to develop a new piece of city there. No, we said first we define the qualities. Second, we repair the wrong decisions of the traffic infrastructure as much as we can. And then we create a landscape framework in which we also use the sound contours to prevent too much urbanization. And then what is left, these little neighborhoods here, can be successively constructed in the course of time. It's also a phasing strategy, because these big urban design projects, sometimes people create an enormous desert, and then 25 years nothing happens. So, and our verdict is, make your neighborhoods compact so that the neighborhood can successively grow, and therefore you more or less always have a finished condition after every phase of completion, which is much better, because then you have a situation in which your design can react to unexpected circumstances. So here you see it from the top, from the other side, and here you can clearly see the concept of the square on top of the tracks as the railway station. You see the blocks that are isolating the tracks and protecting these neighborhoods. You see one unit of neighborhood very strongly embedded in green and in urban farming that is still there, allotment gardens, etc. Water management is very important. So if you work in the urbanized landscape, which is not the city, but which is also not the countryside, but which is the urbanized landscape, which contains factories, airports, but also most of the agriculture. For instance, in Switzerland, or in the Randstad Holland, or in the Delta south of Bangkok or near Jakarta, you have the most dense population and industry per square kilometer, but you also have the highest agricultural output per hectare. It is not so that those areas don't have agriculture. No, on the contrary, they combine highly urbanized areas with agriculture, which is super interesting. And so what we say is, if you look, for instance, at the area around Zurich in Switzerland, you have something like 10 factors we call braking factors. One of them is, of course, these noise contours that protect the landscape against over-urbanization. So you saw it just in this Montpellier plan. We use these factors not to boost development, but to prevent an area for over-urbanization. In Switzerland, these factors are, for instance, the forest law. You are not allowed to attack forests, they are protected. The landscape initiative, which means that protected landscape views are protected. Then you have the so-called disaster food services, auf Deutsch Fruchtfolgefläche. It's a very interesting thing. It means that in Switzerland you have to have a minimum surface of agricultural surface that can feed the population in times of war. And there's a calculation for it, how much that should be. Then you have the regional zoning plan in Switzerland. Very interesting because it's a zoning plan that goes across the whole province. Instead of letting every city and every municipality define its own zoning. So the province defines where you are allowed to build and where not. So that is a coordination which is very important. It prevents villages and towns to grow together. You have water management, you have topography, specifically in Switzerland. Above 600 to 700 meters nobody lives anymore. And what is very helpful always is fragmented property. Investors and developers always complain, there's so many owners in this land, I can never buy it and I can never develop it. This is really very good because it's a kind of braking factor against over-urbanization, and small parcels also create more sustainable urban conditions because you have to build in smaller units and you create a larger diversity, and you also are forced to build incrementally. You grow gradually instead of you kind of do tabula rasa and immediately build something full. Then you have, of course, the direct democracy with the referendum, etc. So we are saying in Switzerland, urban design is like skiing. It's the art of braking elegantly. This is maybe one of the biggest projects. I show you another bigger one in a minute in terms of built volume and density that we worked on. The HafenCity in Hamburg. It's a project that when you look at it, you can see it here. It is extremely diverse in architecture and also in plot size. So this was an experiment that was supported by politics and was also supported by the investment company that was created to develop the HafenCity. And it was not at all in the beginning clear that it would be a success. There were many developers and investors who said, guys, what you are doing there is not economical. It's not viable. Your building plots are too small. You use too many architects. Then you need more contractors. You have too many details. It costs all too much money. In the end, the opposite is the case. First of all, it becomes an incremental project in which the development grows instead that it is just laying there for 20 years and then it's single or 2 times built. Secondly, the diversity attracts people who want to live or to buy in a certain house. Thirdly, the real estate prices have been going up quite well because of the attraction that it creates. And also what has proven to be working very well is that headquarters of companies like SAP here or like Unilever here outside the picture, they have no problem of settling their headquarters for northern Germany in between residential conditions. So in fact, all the principles that the investors were doubtful about have been, on the contrary, quite successful and are now the basis and also form an example for developments elsewhere. We are now about 60% of HafenCity is ready. This part here is ready. You saw the Elb Philharmonic building by Herzog Dömmel Architects here just a minute ago. This part is now being under construction. Everything is more or less decided yet. In the meantime, HafenCity is active here and is active here. This is the first jump of the city of Hamburg across the river, which in other cities like London or Paris, of course, has been done in the past already a long time ago. But Hamburg has been traditionally a city on the north side of the river, where this was the main harbor in the medieval times, and then later this became the harbor. Now they are going to expand from its city center across the river, across the HafenCity, across the river to the south, and then to the city of Harburg. This is not a joke. This city exists really. It's only much smaller than Hamburg, but there will be an axis Hamburg-Harburg in the future. And this piece here, which we planned in the wake of the Olympic bid for the Olympic Games in Germany in 2024, which were cancelled by a referendum, but of course that doesn't matter. On this southern part of the harbor. This is a tradition that several cities try to do, to say, okay, we want to have the Olympic Games as a kind of engine of urban transformation, and then a lot of the investment we put into the Olympic Games we can use to create new metro lines, subway stations, etc., public amenities. This has been calculated recently. This is total nonsense. It is costing an enormous amount of money, the Olympic Games, but you can say that the Olympic Games have been, in the case of Barcelona, in the case of London, and also here in the case of Hamburg, although they were not realized, the trigger for urban redevelopment and urban renovation. And contrary to, for instance, Athens, where they built all the Olympic amenities outside of the city, which was an enormous investment, and which is now rusting and not being used for anything at all. So the Olympic Games didn't take place, but the result was that politically this piece of land was in the picture of the politicians. It was in the picture of the town planners who wanted to expand the city, but not by peripheral development, but by inner city densification and mixed use. And so now, recently, a year after this bid of the Olympic Games was done, there's an official development of this area going on. One of the very interesting aspects of it is that this area is going to be not similar to HafenCity that you see here, but this area is going to be a mixed-use neighborhood. And it is not the kind of cliche mixed use that we are all talking about, looking at Prenzlauer Berg in Berlin, or Greenwich Village in New York, or Soho in London. This is real hardcore mixed use, which means that logistics related to the harbor, whole ground floors of blocks are going to be reserved for manufacturing and production, for large-scale business, mixed with residential and workplace development. And of course, this is first of all possible because industry and logistics are creating less and less emissions and less noise. Secondly, the mobility systems are evolving up to such an extent that a kind of smart and lean way of transport is becoming possible. And last but not least, this is not a dream, this is an economic trend, because we should not believe as architects and urban designers that we can say, like many old-fashioned urbanists think, we should live in a compact city, so we should all go back into the city. You have a very nice resident of Luxembourg, too, the brothers Queer, who say that. They say we should not let people live in the periphery, they should live in the city. But this is not possible to achieve by means of an ideological exclamation. This is the result of an economic trend. This economic trend is that the economy is atomizing on the one hand, so you have much more small-scale entrepreneurship than before. You have much more also very large-scale firms like Apple or Google, but they are also making use of very many small-scale entrepreneurs that kind of network and cluster into these ecosystems that create economic production. Households are atomizing, which means that families have multiple activities. In the old days, the father was working and the rest was in the neighborhood going to school or shopping. Today, every member of a family is doing a serious job somewhere else, whether it is studying or whether it is working and earning money. They are busy and they need amenities and services that normally the housewife would do in the house. So the result is that all these activities together with this atomization, together with the reduction of emissions and the kind of smart production of different forms of energy, leads to a renaissance of the city, a re-densification of the city that is not the result of some prophets that tell us that we should live in the city, but the result of social economic trends. And this is very positive. And this is what happens also in Hamburg. And this is also why the investors are willing to build these kind of new typologies that can accommodate such kind of economy. And that is very promising. Now, these big projects is also a trend. Everywhere in the world you see these enormous big projects going on. So we have decided in our university to start a research called the Grand Projet, in which we list and then see what happens with these projects. So here you see a timeline in which these, you see the proliferation of the projects, you see also the increase in size of these projects over time. We have analyzed something like 25 countries and cities, and destiled in the end 8 projects that we are comparing to each other, which are Luyatrui in Shanghai, which is this skyscraper area. It's also well known as Pudong Island. We look at Tokyo Station, which is called Marinuchi, developed by Mitsubishi Corporation. We look at West-Kowloon in Hong Kong, which is the new high-speed railway terminal from China and shopping area. We look at Marina Bay in Singapore. So we have 4 Asian projects. And then we have 4 European projects, Paris La Défense, let's say as the mother of the big post-war projects. King's Cross in London, Hamburg, HafenCity, and 22 in Barcelona. And we look at how are they conceived, how are they designed, how is the implementation process, and what is their impact. And the 2 aspects that we are specifically looking at is adaptability and inclusiveness. So here you see we are depicting these projects in the same way in maps. We have all kinds of parameters that we compare to them. We also look at them, for instance, here King's Cross, in the range of big projects in the city itself, London. For instance, we look at Canary Wharf as well in relation to King's Cross. Canary Wharf is a little bit like La Défense in Paris. It's a kind of aircraft carrier that was conceived somewhere in Toronto and then landed in London in one go, and was a kind of gated office park with enormous towers, floor slabs like football fields, because the legislation in the Anglo-Saxon countries allows you to have no light, no daylight in your workplace. That's why these, also in Asia, all these towers are so enormously big. And so it is a kind of, bad projects. We call these projects, these original 1960s projects, we call them wolves. And we call projects like King's Cross, we call them sheep because they are more innocent. But the interesting thing is that the wolf, after 35, 40 years, gradually becomes a sheep. Because it attracts housing, it attracts public transport, it attracts all these amenities I was just talking about. And in the end, a certain cluster of mixing is established in which they become less harmful than they originally were, which is kind of a positive. I mean, you notice that I'm quite optimistic despite the terrible development of urbanization. You see La Défense, this is the core, for instance, and you see it has created an enormous spin-off. This whole area here is being developed now. So it creates a kind of city within the city, and the whole project itself is constantly redeveloped. On this moment, every office building in La Défense only lives for 35 years in average. After 35 years, it's completely replaced. So that means you can anticipate on a future qualification of such a project. Here you see Luyazui in Shanghai, which was co-developed by La Défense. That's why it also has a big Champs-Élysées. The only difference is that it leads to nowhere. And you see the terrible public space that it shows. And it's very interesting to compare it to Wall Street at the tip of Manhattan. This is the same scale. So here, the interesting thing is they have about the same amount of square meters of built volume as in Manhattan. But they have enormous buildings. This is a section of a building, and in Manhattan this is only a building. And you see that the difference between the urban quality of the Wall Street area and this area here, it's just miles on an end outside of each other. We particularly look at Singapore also, because we as ETH in Zurich, we have a laboratory of urban development research in Singapore. And we look at the urbanization in Southeast Asia, not only Singapore, but also Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, India, Bangladesh, and so on. And in Singapore, you have a kind of history of these big projects. So they start also like La Défense with the kind of inner city, or more like Wall Street the inner city building skyscrapers on top of existing plots, which actually is still the most successful. Then they start to make very, very big one-of-a-kind projects with shopping malls that are connected, interconnected, that create enormous labyrinths, streetscapes which are covered, have nothing to do with outside. Singaporeans don't like to be outside, they only like to be inside, because they are originally mainly Chinese who come from the north, and they live in a tropical climate where there's an enormous humidity and at least 28 degrees Celsius. So most of the people prefer to be in an air-conditioned situation, which we Europeans and also we Dutchmen who had colonized Indonesia, which was a bad black chapter in our history, but what we at least were used to is to live in the tropical air instead of in an air-conditioned condition. For me, this is an interesting picture because this is the CEO of HafenCity, Professor Bruns Berendelg, learning from Singapore. And here you see that there's an evolution. Here you see this Wall Street area, and you see these big covered projects. Here you see still the old colonial neighborhoods where the streetscape is outside. And then here you see the new CBD, which is still consisting out of this big Canary Wharf-like skyscrapers. And then you see the newest development, which is already very much geared towards a European block structure with lower podia, courtyards, and towers that come outside of it. So it's a kind of historical evolution of larger project concepts. This is the CBD area that is now almost in completion. And this is this last Marina Bay South district with the podia and the towers. They clearly look very much at the projects where we as European architects and designers work for, like King's Cross in London, the Olympic Legacy, the HafenCity, the Ile de Nantes, all these projects where we are very strongly working with diversity, with permeability of the perimeter block, with a relationship between low-rise and high-rise, with mixed use, and with very high quality of public space. And you can see in these diagrams, also you cannot see it very well in this projection, that they are really working on it. And it's not for nothing that their artist impressions look very much like European urban renewal projects that we all are involved in. So in Asia, there's a real trend to look at Europe, but to pose the question: how can we be like Europe, but at the same time create 5 times the density in our cities? And that's one of the latest projects that we work on. I will show you a little film. I will only say something afterward. It lasts 4 minutes. Maybe here. Yeah. So maybe I say something. This is the new high-speed railway station coming from Kuala Lumpur to Singapore. You arrive underground under a park, and then you have very, very high density blocks that have a podium, which is around 30 meters high with an obligatory green surface. Then you have an intermediate level, and then you have a roofscape level on 130 meters, where every building is obligatory having a green garden, so that in the end you will have a vision of a city in which there's a kind of floating carpet of green in the air. This neighborhood is part of 3 new centers that they are building. This is the center. Next to the city center, the airport, and the gateway to Malaysia in the north. And this one will contain the high-speed railway line and also is the center of the university campus areas. It is situated on an island system with a lot of green and parks. And we have compacted the neighborhood to such an extent that you have a very, very high density, but leave as much green space open as possible by laying the railways and the motorway and all other infrastructure underground. The principle that we use here is the same actually as we deployed in Rotterdam and in Zurich. So we have this system of a podium structure that is lower, and then we have the ability to make high towers that have to be slender in order not to hinder each other to create daylight and view, not sun, because they don't like sun there, of course. And here you enter the area across the park. And you see that in the center part we have a double pedestrian area that connects all the different railway stations that come together there with each other. The podia of the buildings, these lower parts of the buildings that you see, this is the station, they are having large atria, patios, so they can contain complete clusters of the ecosystems I talked you about before. They can accommodate in these zones different enterprises that share lobbies, that share dedicated spaces, that share gastronomy, canteens, printing shops, etc., in order to create a condition of collaboration. And on top of these podia, as I said, you have a green, an obligatory green park system. Are residential buildings that can also be hotels that go up to the sky. And this particular solution was awarded because we were able, by this building typology, to leave about 50% of the whole area not built and turn it into a water-absorbing landscape park system on which these buildings are. And by means of this porous system of patios and atrium in the lower parts, we create a condition of natural ventilation in which for the public spaces air conditioning is not possible. It was calculated how the wind speeds are going through these different spaces and streetscapes, which by the way is a car light area with very few motorized vehicles. And within this system you can have a flexibility to create different kinds of urban amenities, whereas towards the sky you will have a freestanding residential condition that has a much better orientation and view, and also benefits from natural ventilation much more than traditional building volumes, as a kind of living condition. And it's a necessary exercise, because the density in cities like this are mostly at least 5 times the density that you will find here in Europe, and maybe even 10 times that you will find here in Luxembourg. And these densities are happening. Again, we cannot, as urban designers, say a density of 2.8 in this piece of city is the maximum. It's not possible. In the end, the forces of society and economy define what will be the density in an area. And so this is the reason why, as urbanists, we expose ourselves more like people who take a challenge as a, let's say, as a group of people who want to try to repair a condition of wrong decisions that are always being made in complex urban conditions. And we also try to exploit the programmatic and volumetric aspects as much as possible in order to investigate whether we can find a different solution for the question that has been posed to us. And I think we are also people that are not telling people that we are the designers of a piece of city. We are not like an idiosyncratic architect that wants his copyright on his design. We as urban designers know, first of all, that we are only a little cogwheel in the machine. Secondly, we only can, by experience, know where we have impact and where we have no impact. And last but not least, we also know that most of the time we do not survive the end of such a big project. So you have to work on your own death inside the period of the realization of the project. Thank you very much.